Everything she said, from the very first word to the last, was being recorded. Every word she spoke was destined to be used against her. She threatened to destroy his life. And in a way, it was true. She tried, but with that one call, everything changed. She would never be able to hurt him again. Now her life was hanging by a thread, and it depended on him. All this time, while she enjoyed the show, she was the clown being watched with growing curiosity. The police were with him, guiding, orchestrating, and just when they began to doubt the case would ever be solved, the killer brought them closer to the truth than he ever intended. San Luis Obispo, California. Angel Gate Academy, run by the U.S. National Guard, was something akin to a boot camp, a place where mentors skillfully guided and taught valuable skills to young people who might otherwise have taken a wrong turn in life. It was here that Angelina first took notice of Jose Francisco Rodriguez, who preferred to be called Frank. Angie had already been married 3 times and was raising her daughter, Autumn. Frank was also divorced. Both Angie and Frank had military backgrounds, and they were drawn to the idea of working with troubled teens. Kind, empathetic, and able to connect easily with kids, Frank immediately caught Angie's attention. Frank had certainly taken notice of the attractive woman with large brown eyes and a warm, captivating smile. But behind Angelina's sincere expression were painful memories she rarely spoke about. She told Frank that when she was very young, her father had walked out on the family, leaving her mother to raise 2 daughters alone. Her mother worked 2 jobs just to keep them afloat, so Angelina was effectively raised by her older sister and their grandfather. Grandfather molested little Angelina from early childhood until almost the end of her school years. She herself was still essentially a child when she realized she was pregnant. Angie terminated the pregnancy. All this affected her so much that Angelina wanted to end her life. But she survived, moved away from her grandfather, and began to live independently. At 19, Angelina got married for the first time to Hector Gonzalez. But the marriage ended quickly. She married again, this time to Tom Fuller. During that marriage, she gave birth to 2 beautiful daughters, Autumn and Alicia. For a while, it seemed like Angelina's life was finally coming together, as if the universe was rewarding her for all the suffering she had endured in her youth. But fate had more heartbreak in store. When Alicia was just 13 months old, she died in her crib due to a defective pacifier. A part of it broke off and became lodged in her throat. Although the manufacturer would later recall all pacifiers of that model, it was too late for Alicia. The young couple couldn't recover from the tragedy, and they eventually separated. Angelina tried once more to find happiness in marriage with Don Combs. By the time she met Frank, Angelina had all but given up on love. But Frank believed they were soulmates. He was ready to care for her and her daughter, and he promised they would never have to suffer like that again. In April 2000, 41-year-old Frank and 32-year-old Angelina became husband and wife. Shortly after, Frank was offered a teaching position in the quiet Los Angeles suburb of Montebello. He accepted the job, and the family relocated. They were happy in their new home, but misfortune seemed to follow them. Not long after the wedding, a gas leak occurred in the house. If Frank hadn't noticed it in time, the consequences could have been catastrophic. At 3 a.m. on Saturday, September 9, 2000, before the sun had risen over the Los Angeles suburb of Montebello, a panicked woman called the police. She was terrified. Her husband had suddenly fallen ill, and she feared he wouldn't survive the night. By the time emergency responders arrived, the man was already dead. He was lying face down on the bedroom floor. He had vomited before dying and had a small amount of blood coming from his nose. Not unusual at death scenes. The deceased was 41-year-old Frank Rodriguez. The 911 call had come from his wife, Angelina. She told authorities that she had fallen asleep on the couch while watching TV. When she woke up and went to the bedroom, she found Frank lying on the floor. He had vomited and was unresponsive. That's when she called for help. Angelina didn't cry, but the officers knew from experience that people grieve in different ways. She told them Frank hadn't been feeling well for the past few days. She had taken him to the hospital, where doctors suspected food poisoning. They advised her to keep him hydrated with fluids like Gatorade and tea, and to make sure he got plenty of rest. Angelina said she followed all the medical advice carefully, but Frank didn't improve, and that night she found him on the bedroom floor. She told the officers she couldn't understand how food poisoning could have taken her husband's life. The officers didn't have an answer either. The coroner examined Frank's body. There were no signs of trauma or injury. Could it have been a heart attack? A stroke? The coroner took the body for autopsy to find out. Detectives asked for permission to look around the house. Angie agreed. The home was neat and orderly. There was no blood, nothing out of place, and no indication that Frank had tripped or fallen. Nothing at all seemed suspicious. The officers left Angelina to grieve and to notify Frank's family about his sudden, unexplained death. Frank grew up in Lincoln, Illinois. He was the eldest of 5 children. When he was 8 years old, his parents divorced. After his father left, young Frank stepped into the role of man of the house, taking care of his younger siblings, walking them to school, making breakfast. As he got older, he joined the Navy and served during the Gulf War, Desert Storm. He wrote to his mother regularly, kept her updated on his life, and sent her gifts from every country he visited. But like many young men suddenly thrust into the vastness of the world, Frank picked up a few bad habits. He began to drink. Fortunately, he recognized early on that he was heading down the wrong path, and he made the choice to quit drinking. That turning point is part of what made him so well suited to working with troubled teens at Angel Gate Academy, where he landed a job after 14 years of Navy service. It was there that he met Angie, and the two quickly fell in love. Just 5 months after his family had celebrated his wedding, they were receiving the devastating news of Frank's death. Like Angelina, they struggled to believe it, and even more so to accept it. Meanwhile, the medical examiner performed the autopsy and found nothing. No signs of trauma from a blow, fall, gunshot, or stab wound. Frank's organs were in excellent condition. There were no signs of respiratory failure, no asthma-related issues. He was, by all accounts, a completely healthy man, except that he was dead. The autopsy raised more questions than it answered. The police began to think they had no choice but to rule the death as an unfortunate accident. But then they received a clue, one that would completely change the course of the investigation. Angelina wanted the detectives to know that there was someone who didn't like her husband, a former colleague from Angel Gate Academy. His name was Chad Holloway, and he had been accused of child abuse and even molestation. An investigation had been launched after someone reported him. According to Angelina, Chad held a grudge against Frank because he believed Frank had reported him. And since on the Wednesday before Frank's death, he had agreed to accompany a school bus to the camp, Angelina suspected that Chad had poisoned her husband. The next day, investigators went to the camp to speak with the staff, focusing especially on Chad. They interviewed about 20 people and discovered 2 important things. First, the allegations against Chad had already been thoroughly investigated and were completely unfounded. No one had ever believed them. Second, everyone at the academy loved Frank and considered him a friend, including Chad. On the other hand, Chad didn't deny being very angry at whoever had cast suspicion on him and threatened to find and punish that person. He said he had served in the military and been through a lot, but had never been as terrified as when he was accused of molesting children. Chad was genuinely furious, and according to the police, someone in that state might be driven to commit a crime. But there was one catch. Frank had agreed to accompany the kids on the trip to the camp at the very last minute. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, and until Frank got off the bus in San Luis Obispo, no one at the camp knew he would be coming. Chad couldn't have known either, which meant he couldn't have prepared poison to kill the victim days later. It was unlikely that Chad always carried poison with him. There was more. Chad said that when he and Frank met, they hugged and chatted for a couple of minutes. Then Chad went to the kids, and Frank and the bus were supposed to head back to Los Angeles. Chad had no opportunity to slip anything into Frank's food or drink while he was at the camp. Moreover, everyone who saw Frank noted that he already looked unwell, sickly, thin, and a shadow of the man he used to be. Meanwhile, Frank's relatives arrived in Los Angeles to say their final goodbyes. After the church service, Angelina, Frank's sisters, and his mother got into a limousine that took them to the cemetery. As Frank's sisters discussed what could have caused such a sudden death, Angelina declared that he might have been poisoned. She pointed out a plant commonly found throughout the city, oleander. People often get poisoned by it. Looking out the window at the beautiful blooming bushes, she said, "That's oleander." Oleander, which grows along highways, especially in Central and Northern California, is indeed highly toxic. But why did she specifically mention it? Frank's sisters and mother were stunned by her suggestion. Even the coroner had no clue what caused the death. Later, the women called the sheriff's office and asked them to investigate the possibility that Frank had been poisoned by oleander. Investigators tried to speak with Angelina directly to have her repeat her oleander theory, but she pretended not to understand where they were going with it. However, through the sliding glass door of Angelina's house, the backyard was clearly visible. There stood a magnificent, blooming neighbor's bush that slightly overhung Angelina's property. It was a large, branching oleander with stunningly beautiful flowers, narrow, dark green leaves, and a deadly poison. While Frank's death remained a mystery, Angelina's detailed knowledge and then sudden amnesia about the oleander seemed suspicious. The forensic expert's report on oleander poisoning was expected to take some time, so the detective spoke with Angelina's friends to learn more about her character. One of her longtime close friends was Palmyra Gorham. Palmyra revealed that, as close friends, they often joked in ways others might find inappropriate. Shortly after Angelina's marriage, she complained to Palmyra about being bored in the relationship. When Palmyra asked why she hadn't divorced her fourth husband like the previous three, Angelina replied, "He's insured, so it's worth putting up with. If I kill him, I'll get the money," she added. The friends then jokingly discussed how such a thing might be done and what poisoning methods they had heard of. Palmyra mentioned oleander, saying it could be mixed into tea because its bitter taste is easily masked. Angelina became very interested and fired Palmyra a dozen questions about oleander. At the time, Palmyra thought nothing of it. They were just joking. But Frank's sudden and unexplained death shook her confidence in that. Finally, the forensic expert's report arrived. It confirmed that oleander was indeed found in Frank's body, but not in a lethal amount. This left the investigators puzzled. Did this mean two types of poison were used? And how could they determine what the second one was? Since oleander was definitely present in Frank's system, the police focused their attention on Angelina. However, the detectives decided to withhold this information, even though it was difficult, as Angelina was constantly bombarding them with calls. There's nothing unusual about desperate calls from the victim's loved ones demanding justice. But Angie's daily calls had a different purpose. She didn't hide the fact that she wanted the insurance payout, and the investigators realized money was her main driving force. However, the insurance company explained that since Frank died within 2 years of the policy being taken out, they would first conduct their own investigation, and Angie wouldn't receive any money until the cause of death was determined. Angie likely didn't know this. So, if Frank was poisoned, could financial gain be the possible motive? The investigators decided to dig deeper to find out. The insurance agent told detectives that Angelina and Frank had purchased a $250,000 life insurance policy. Frank frankly didn't understand why they needed it. After all, they were already covered through his job in the National Guard. But Angelina was so insistent that the agent just leaned back in his chair and watched her do the convincing for him. The couple also agreed to take out a $50,000 policy on Angelina, but never followed through. The agent revealed that before sunrise the morning after Frank's death, Angelina called him, asking when she would receive the money. She bombarded him with calls, just like she did the police. She was in a rush to buy a house and wanted the agent to confirm to her realtor that the payout was imminent, but he refused. He simply couldn't be certain of anything yet. After speaking with the agent, the investigators were nearly certain Angelina believed she had committed the perfect murder. But maybe it was too perfect, and she was about to discover she wouldn't get a dime without a confirmed cause of death. Tests for various known poisons came back negative, leaving investigators desperate to figure out what toxin had been used. They started a cat-and-mouse game with Angelina, convincing her that the cause of death couldn't be confirmed without identifying the exact poison. She called almost every day, while they kept stalling, assuring her the coroner was still working. What else could she do? Surely she thought the police were clueless enough not to catch on if she didn't reveal the poison herself. In early October, Angelina called the detectives again with a fascinating story. She said an unknown man had contacted her from an untraceable number. The caller claimed to have great respect for her late husband and insisted he had something important to share. Allegedly, Chad Holloway told him the police wouldn't be able to pin the murder on him. Then the call started cutting out, and all Angelina could hear was, "Ask them about antifreeze." It sounded convincing, but Angie forgot one thing. The police could easily get phone records and verify that no anonymous calls were made to her. Still, the detectives got what they wanted. Antifreeze wasn't on the list of traditional poisons tested for during the autopsy, so the coroner started a special analysis. While waiting for the results, Angie kept trying to frame Chad. 2 anonymous letters demanding Chad's arrest arrived at the sheriff's office fax. At the end of January 2001, 4 months after Frank's sudden death, the medical examiner found ethylene glycol, a component of antifreeze, in the man's body. And thus the cause of death was antifreeze poisoning. In any other situation, it could have been assumed that the man ingested it accidentally. But considering all the gathered information and the amount of ethylene glycol in Frank's body, in addition to the oleander, the coroner concluded that the man had been murdered. The investigators also had no doubt about the identity of the killer. The only thing left was to prove it. They spoke once again with Angelina's relatives and friends. It turned out that once in the presence of Angelina, Palmira's boyfriend and mother had discussed antifreeze. They talked about how it's sweet and that, for example, children might drink it without suspecting anything, which is very dangerous. In other words, Angelina was told about two methods of poisoning, rare but effective. The police suspected that she first gave her husband a little oleander, which made him feel ill. But that wasn't enough to kill him, so she switched to antifreeze. The question was how to prove it. The detectives met with Chad again and asked for his help. They emphasized that they believed in his innocence and that Angelina was behind all his troubles, including the accusations of molesting minors. Chad readily agreed to assist. They outlined a rough script for the conversation, and he called Angelina. However, the call was short. Chad only managed to ask why she was accusing him of poisoning Frank with antifreeze. Angelina didn't respond, instead demanding to know how he got her number, saying she shouldn't be talking to him, and then hung up. Less than a minute later, Angelina contacted the detective, claiming Chad had called her and threatened her. According to her, Chad told her to keep quiet or she would regret it because they wouldn't be able to catch him anyway. The detective asked, "Did he threaten you?" And Angelina confirmed, "Yes, I'm scared to death." Of course, Chad never said any of that, as the police witnessed. Angelina was arrested and taken to jail to await trial for the murder of Frank Rodriguez. During a search of her home, officers found a napkin with the sheriff's fax number on it, meaning she could have been the sender of the anonymous letters the detectives had received. Additionally, officers found a piece of paper where the grieving widow had outlined how she planned to spend the insurance money. The officers also spoke with Autumn, Angelina's 9-year-old daughter. The girl had genuinely loved Frank as a father and was deeply grieving. She revealed that Frank had a personal bottle for his Gatorade sports drink. Angelina gave this bottle to Autumn and insisted that the girl make sure Frank drank every last drop. Moreover, the girl was strictly forbidden to take even a sip herself. Once in jail, Angelina believed that the only evidence the police had against her was Palmira's testimony. So Angie called her friend and warned her if she didn't change her statement, she would be arrested as an accomplice. Angelina even had a story ready for Palmira to tell the police in her defense. Supposedly, Palmira caught Angelina with her boyfriend and, out of revenge, made up the whole story about the poison. Palmira refused to cooperate, but Angelina didn't calm down. She believed that if her friend couldn't testify, that alone would be enough to plant doubt in the jurors' minds. In the neighboring cell was Gwendolyn Hall, whom Angelina considered a hardened criminal. Angelina decided that Gwendolyn would surely find a way to hire a hitman to kill Palmira, or Gwendolyn would do it herself. Angie promised first $20,000, then increased the offer to $30,000 for the job. In reality, Gwendolyn had no intention of looking for a killer. She chose to turn in the contractor. The police gave her a recorder, and sitting in the cell next to Angelina, she recorded every word. Angelina suggested staging the murder as a robbery gone wrong or framing Palmira's boyfriend. Thus, the police obtained proof that the accused tried to hire a hitman to kill Palmira. But there was a catch. Detectives didn't know if the contractor would stop there. What if Angelina hired someone else? And what if that person really did attack Palmira? Credit where it's due, the detectives came up with another brilliant plan to protect Palmira and help Angelina dig herself even deeper into trouble. They asked Palmira if she would agree to fake her own death. Palmira agreed, reasoning logically that it was better for the police to kill her in jest than for someone else to actually harm her. Using professional makeup, the detectives staged a murder scene and took a photo of the victim. Then, a police officer posing as the hitman met Angelina in prison and showed her the photo of Palmira lying on a bed with a bullet wound in her head. At first, Angelina was horrified and whispered that she was just joking. The detectives listened carefully, relieved, thinking that they had been wrong about her, that maybe she hadn't really planned to kill her friend. But then Angelina's lips curved into a wide, genuine smile and she said, "I'm going home. I'm ready to go home." 2 years after Frank's murder, his wife stood trial. The prosecution presented their theory that Angelina had started by adding oleander to her husband's tea and soups. But since the plan acted too slowly, she began to pour antifreeze into the Gatorade sports drink he consumed. On the witness stand was Palmira, who described how shortly before Frank's death, she had called Angelina and overheard a blender running in the background. Angelina said she was making a special milkshake for her husband. Palmira knew that Frank only drank it when he was unwell and asked if he was sick. Angelina replied, "Not yet." But if Angelina thought Palmira would be the prosecution's key witness, she hadn't counted on one more person. At the trial, Angelina's lover, Palmira's nephew Lauren Moranis, testified. He revealed that shortly before Frank's death, he had complained about being tired of secret meetings. Angelina assured him things would soon change. She had taken care of it. She confessed to him that she had deliberately damaged the gas line in the garage, hoping Frank would either be poisoned by gas or die in a house explosion. If Frank hadn't smelled the gas and called a technician, he could have died then and there. The technician concluded that someone had damaged the gas line in 2 places. Lauren explained he hadn't reported this earlier because he didn't want to get involved. Angelina was found guilty of murder for financial gain, but not guilty of solicitation to murder. However, this was not the worst surprise in the case. When it came time to determine the sentence, the prosecution demanded the death penalty and revealed that Frank's murder was just the tip of the iceberg. A few years ago, in 1992, Angelina, her second husband Tom, and their children, Otham and Alicia, traveled to Michigan to visit relatives and relax. They stopped at a restaurant for dinner, where a stranger approached them and, apologizing, mentioned that the company that manufactured baby pacifiers had received complaints about the model Alicia was using, as it could be dangerous. The woman clearly intended to warn the parents, but she inadvertently gave Angelina an idea. Angie took out a $50,000 insurance policy on her daughter, and just a few days later, Alicia died because of the pacifier. When emergency responders arrived, they were surprised to see Angelina waiting outside. From their experience, they knew a mother would never abandon a choking or suffocating child. Nonetheless, the child's death was ruled an accident. Angelina collected the insurance money and compensation from the manufacturer, totaling about $750,000. She received 60% of that amount, while Tom got the rest. The pacifiers were subsequently recalled. When Angie received the huge payout for Alicia's death, she realized that murder could be a very profitable business, especially if you could get away with it. However, upon closer examination of the evidence, detectives noticed that the pacifier had been pulled and torn with some kind of tool. The child could not have done this herself. An expert declared that the only way Alicia could have died was if the pacifier was broken and deliberately pushed down her throat. She was definitely murdered. But after all these years, detectives and prosecutors could not charge Angelina with murder. Although the case did not proceed, the cause of Alicia's death was officially changed from an accident to homicide. On January 12, 2004, Angelina was sentenced to death by lethal injection. She became the 19th woman sentenced to death in California. However, California has a moratorium on the death penalty, so she will remain in prison for the rest of her life. Angelina committed an almost perfect murder. The police would never have discovered the poison that killed Frank, and his wife might have walked away free. But in order to receive the insurance payout, she had to reveal the case for the police. She succeeded in doing that and led investigators to the real killer. By killing her husband, she wanted the insurance money to buy a house, but ended up locked in a solitary death row cell with no money at all.